Looks to be okay. All right, well, let me know if you need me to... Oh, she's reconnecting. I think it was probably her end. Hey, Molly, are you back? Hello?
Hear me now?
There you go. Now I can hear you.
Okay. I don't know. It's weird. I don't know what problem it
Can you hear me?
is. Yes.
Okay. All right, so today is the last day on this chapter. I think it's unlikely I will get to the cold information, so I'm going to let you guys finish off the cold part of the chapter on your own, and I will double check that I have the PowerPoint up for that. It should be 11 part 3, so I'll just make sure that that's there. Friday we had started looking at heat illnesses, and we had looked at heat cramps and syncope. So level 3 is heat exhaustion, and there's lots of different factors that can play into developing heat exhaustion. Some of them are if you're sweating very heavily. As always, dehydration comes up. With the heavy sweating, you might see sodium loss and imbalance, and energy depletion, just overall unable to keep up with ATP production. So more typically in hot and humid environments, so that heavy sweating is running down your body rather than evaporating, and so it's not doing the job of helping to keep you cool. So you see it more often in the south than you would over here in the southwest. And one of the things we have to be careful about is that it's often confused with exertional heat stroke. And I'll come back to that because heat stroke is a lot more dangerous. Heat exhaustion is uncomfortable and not nice, but if it's treated, you're going to be okay. But heat stroke is a lot more serious. So what you're looking for to keep an eye out on your students or your athletes or your clients, whoever you're working with, is someone who's consistently cramping. Maybe they've gone quite pale. The fainting, dizziness, and headache that lead up to syncope. They might start to hyperventilate, and if they're hyperventilating, they're going to blow off carbon dioxide and get that tingly feeling in their fingers and around their lips. Decreased urine output, and their core body temperature is starting to go above normal. So anywhere from 97 up to 104 would be classified as heat exhaustion. All right. So what we have to be careful of, if you're not sure, because say you can't take their core temperature, whether they have heat exhaustion or heat stroke, then we want to treat for heat stroke because that one can kill you. All right. So we don't want to risk looking at the symptoms and saying, oh, well, I think it's heat exhaustion, right? We just want to assume that it's heat stroke. That's the safest course of action. And then what happens is that we see a drop in cerebral blood flow here, and so that deals with some of the dizziness and fainting. So in syncope and in heat exhaustion, the brain's not really getting enough blood flow. And so that then will lead into the reason for heat stroke and some of the symptoms that we see for heat stroke. So, as I said, heat stroke is really dire. If it's not treated very quickly, it can lead to death or brain damage. So it's really important that we take this seriously. Like when we talked about the altitude sickness, you know, once you get to pulmonary edema, this is pretty serious. If you get cerebral edema, then there's a very good chance that you're not going to come out of that, right? So we have a similar situation here with the heat. So what's going on is this inability of the body to dissipate enough of the core temperature, enough of the heat from the blood and from the organs and from the muscles and the core temperature just keeps rising over that 104. So now it goes up to 105, 106. By the time you get to 109 and a half, you are probably dead already, right? So the thermoregulatory center in the brain, in the hypothalamus, gets completely overwhelmed. You actually, we'll have a look at the symptoms in a minute, but you actually end up stopping sweating because the central nervous system just can't cope. And so you can get a stroke in the brain, and as I said, core temperature is going to be over 104. You haven't got very much wiggle room there. The most accurate way to measure core temperature is using a rectal thermometer. You know, taking it under your tongue or under your armpit, that's not a core temperature. So once we get to these levels of temperature, then there's going to be damage to organs, there's going to be damage to the brain tissue, and we have to just get this person cooled down as quick as possible before it's totally too late. So these are some of the things that can happen. It's not just death, but you know, if you have a look at some of these other complications, they're very serious issues. And so, you know, it's not just having, and feeling a little bit lightheaded, right? Really serious stuff is going to happen. So the signs you're looking for: very increased heart rate, all right? Rapid heart rate, drop in blood pressure, confusion, initially sweating, and then sweating stops, even though they're telling you they feel really hot. There's going to be some confusion or mental state. They may have a seizure. They may have diarrhea during a seizure, and they can drop into a coma. So the best way to cool someone down is to put them in an ice bath, right? Into a tub of cold water with ice, get their whole body under the water. If you can't do that, a cold shower, and get them lying down in the water in the shower, or if you've got a movable shower head, get it all over their body. If you can't get them in a bath or a shower, at least get ice packs on as much of their body as they can, or get towels and get the towels wet and lay those, get all their clothes off and lay wet towels over them. Whatever you can do to try to bring that core temperature down quite rapidly. All right? So there's a really good quote in the textbook on page 327 that death from exertional heat stroke is a tragedy of inaction. That no one should die from this, because we should be recognizing the symptoms earlier and dealing with it as the previous level, right? Level 3, not waiting until it gets to level 4 and now it's too late, right? So, I know when I was at Auburn, they lost one of the football players to exertional heat stroke in pre-training one year. Because they had them outside in the heat, in full equipment. And that article I just have added here. It's got some treatment plans, but I can't remember if this is ACSM, and I can't read that. It's too blurry. So what makes you more or less likely to develop these heat illnesses? So as we mentioned last week, fitness level is really important here, because the higher my cardiovascular, my cardiorespiratory fitness is, the bigger my blood volume, right? So I have more blood to be divided between the working muscle and the skin to let off heat, right? So the fitter I am, the less susceptible I'm going to be to heat illness. Remember that anybody carrying extra fat mass is more likely to be at risk, because that fat lies between your muscle tissue and your arteries and veins and your skin, and it acts like a big fuzzy blanket wrapped around, and so it's much harder to lose heat, right? So if they're a little bit overweight because they haven't done their training during the summer, and their cardiovascular fitness is low because they haven't done their training during the summer, right? Then they're going to be much more at risk when you bring them back for pre-season training. So it's really important to think about that before you put them into an intense training situation. Right? It's all very well to say, well, you guys, you didn't do the maintenance plan I gave you over the summer, so now we have to work really hard to try to get you in shape. But you have to lead into that. You can't just jump into this really hard training situation, right? And then for the first couple of weeks, you really need to focus on cardiovascular fitness, so that if they're going to train and play in the heat, they're fit enough to manage that, right? Also age, so not a problem obviously with your athletes or your school children, but could be a problem for family members or clients if you go personal training type route, or if you go work at a Y or a rec center that has a gym that people come and work in. As we get older, remember, our heart rate drops. We measure, that easy measure for maximum heart rate is 220 minus my age. So every year, my heart rate max comes down, right? So if my heart rate max comes down, then my heart beats per minute is going to be harder to get oxygen around to the body. Right? So cardiovascular function, even if I stay active, cardiovascular function declines just because we're getting older, right? So the more active I stay as I get older, the less decline I'm going to see there, all right? So we also see a decline in cardiac output. Remember, that's heart rate times stroke volume. So if my heart rate is changing or my stroke volume is changing, then cardiac output is going to go down. And that makes it much harder to tolerate the heat because you have this, where does the central nervous system send the blood flow to, right? So if it's going to send the blood flow to the skin to try to keep you a bit cooler, then there's going to be less blood flow to the working muscles, and so intensity and volume come down, right? We can acclimatize to the heat and the humidity, I have to say, right? When I left England and I moved to Alabama, it took me nearly a year, I would say, of being outside a lot on the playground to make that adjustment. It was pretty rough for certainly the first 9-10 months. But we can get, as I said, we can get acclimated. Let's see, and as we get acclimated, capacity will improve a little bit. So it's very important that if you bring athletes or you're working with a new client who's just moved somewhere hot from somewhere cold, that you take all these ideas into account, right? You can't just assume that this person is going to be able to work at a high intensity straight away. You might have to build them up to that. So what we see with performance, if we come back to either a recreational athlete or a competitive athlete, and we look at aerobic performance or endurance events, so marathons and bike rides and things like that, the hotter it gets, the less able we are to perform aerobic work. So a couple of things to bear in mind for that is it's much easier to do that if we're acclimated ahead of time. So what do you do if you've got, if you know that world championships are going to be somewhere ridiculously hot? I mean, obviously if we live here, it's not too much of a problem, although I'll come back to that in a minute. So getting acclimatized ahead of time will help. So can you get to the competition early? That costs money though, right? So, how else can we maybe manage to achieve that? Proper hydration protocols, right? So remember when we did the chapter on hydration that we said everybody needs an individual hydration plan, right? That's really important. And physical conditioning. So what's interesting if you live here is that over the course of the winter, although I'm not quite sure we're going to get a winter this year the way it's going, it's a little bit, it's a little peculiar. I mean, we're, halfway through, almost at the end of November, and we've had one freeze. Yeah, it's very odd. So, but normally, right, you would lose a lot of your heat acclimatization over the winter in New Mexico. And so when it gets really hot, and we don't really have much of a spring, it goes from being really cold to really hot with about a week, if we're lucky, in between, right? So we don't have much time to acclimatize again to the heat. So every year, we have to re-acclimatize to that heat situation here. Now, if you live in Florida, right, it never gets that cold, okay? So if it hits 70, they've all got fleeces and hullernecks and hats on, right? So if you live in Florida, you are used to the heat all year round. And then another measure that you can look for on this, if you just Google wet bulb globe temperature, some really interesting things come up. So this is another measure. It's so at the beginning of this information, we were looking at the heat index, which is the humidity plus the temperature. Wet bulb globe temperature adds in solar radiation and the effect of solar radiation. So it's got these three elements that make this new composite number. And that number can be used to look at whether or not it's a safe day to be outside working, for example. So if the athletic trainers, NCAA, I think, has some rules about, here's the wet bulb globe temperatures that athletes are allowed to be outside. Now, because it includes humidity, here at Eastern, we probably don't have too many days when the athletic trainers are going to call WBGT and cancel outdoor training, I would think. But again, over in Florida or Georgia or any of those states, they are much more likely to be pulled indoors. And what I found it was really interesting is that if you go to the Department of Labor, so you can put in WBGT and it'll pull up these opportunities to calculate it. And so the Department of Labor have a calculation page. You put certain numbers in, like what's the temperature today? What's the humidity today? What's the wind speed today? And it will calculate this for you. And so the idea, I think, there is that companies that have people working outside should be monitoring WBGT to make sure that it's safe for their employees to be outside working that day. So, I thought that was quite interesting. It's not just athletes, right? It's anybody that's got to be outside. And just be a little wary. The book says when you use it in conjunction with the NCAA guidelines, it will prevent heat illness, not if it's not being used properly, right? So I would say it protects against heat illness. Prevents is a bit absolute, right? There's all kinds of factors that are involved in preventing something. The athlete has to do what they're told. The coach has to do what they're told. The athletic trainer has to speak up and say, these are the rules, right? So I suspect the athletic trainers do their part, and it's more likely that the coaches and the athletes don't pay attention. So that's endurance performance. If we look at anaerobic performances, the impact of the performance, I wouldn't say the training, but the performance itself depends a lot upon the length of the event. So 100 meters up to 800 meters, for example, probably don't have any problem at all because they're so quick. Right? They're on and off the track very quickly, and they don't have very much exposure to the heat. Okay? Once we look at longer events, 1,500 meters and above, because they're so much longer, then the heat exposure is that much higher, and they're more likely to see poorer times than normal, perhaps. I think also it's probably easier for track athletes than for the field athletes, because when you watch a big competition, track and field competition, the track athletes tend to come in and out from the walkways and from locker rooms and things, and there's more shade at the edge of the track. The field athletes tend to be stuck out there for the whole event, and that can be a long time, right? Because if you think about high jumping, for example, one person goes, and then the next person goes. So if you've got 20 people in that competition, you only go once every 20 people, and you have to sit there and wait for your next jump. So it's really important, I think, to consider, if you're the person who's in charge of setting up the event, make sure that you've got shade and ice and water and what have you out on the field for those athletes that you can't just keep walking back and forwards across the track, right? There are things going on. So once you're out there, you tend to be there. So it's important to provide shade and ice and water for those field athletes. Hypohydration. So hypohydration is on the way to being dehydrated. So you've already lost some body mass, maybe 1%, 2%. We do start to see reductions in strength and power. Takes a little bit more, you've got more wiggle room, up to about 5% for anaerobic and strength events, as opposed to 2% for endurance events. But still, if you're not paying attention, you're going to see a decrease in performance. Just fancy language. Acclimation is adaptation to an artificial environment. Acclimatization is a natural environment. So acclimation in the altitude stuff would be things like hypoxic tents and those sorts of things. Acclimatization is going up the mountain. In a heat scenario, I guess sitting or doing some training in the sauna, or having the heat up really high in the gym if you want to pay the electric bill, would all be acclimation, or just being outside, right? Spend less time indoors in the air conditioning and more time outside to get acclimatized. Okay, so time course. So when we looked at altitude, we said it's like 3 weeks before we start to see EPO and additional red blood cells start off, right? So for the heat, so 1 to 5 days for your cardiovascular system, you'll start to see an increase in plasma volume and reduced heart rate. So, day 1 and 2, your heart rate for a given workload is going to be much higher than it would be typically. By day 5, hopefully that heart rate is coming down and we get improved blood flow to the muscles, right? Temperature regulation, so that's really core temperature, can take 5 to 8 days, and that will control sweat rate. You'll start to sweat at lower temperatures, and you'll see sweat gland adaptation, so you'll lose less sodium as you acclimatize. The temperature regulation is different, whether it's hot and humid or hot and dry, right? So we know it's harder to regulate temperature when it's hot and humid. Conserving sodium, somewhere from 3 to 9 days. So as I said, you lose less, so your sweat will taste less salty as you get acclimatized, and your kidneys will retain more sodium, and so your urine will have lower sodium content. So if we want to sum up the whole package, it takes about 2 weeks, really, to acclimatize to the heat. And again, that's 2 weeks of being in the heat. So the problem, I think, for a lot of people in the States is the air conditioning situation, right? Because we all run our air too cold, and so that makes it very difficult to truly acclimatize, right? So it'd be much better to cut the air a little bit, spend more time outside, and and then got a 2-week window there. That might impact when you bring your athletes back, perhaps, right? Can you get them back a little bit earlier and have them outside and then really start the training program? I don't know. I don't know enough about college athletics and the rules and what you can and can't do. And then the last point comes back to my comments about being in New Mexico, is that it takes 2 weeks to make these adaptations and only 2.5 to 5 weeks of not being in hot weather for you to lose those adaptations. Remember, adaptations are positive response to stress, right? So if I take the stress away, the adaptations eventually disappear. So, it's cold here for much longer than 5 weeks, typically. We'll see what happens this time, right? And always, hydration status, keep an eye on color of your urine, on body weight, right? Sweating is going to cool you off, but it's also going to play a role in dehydrating you if you don't pay attention, which is one of the problems here, because we sweat and it evaporates and we don't really realize we're sweating, right? Many of our athletes are permanently underhydrated, hyperhydrated. So that makes them much more susceptible to some form of heat illness. We've got to hydrate, if you again go back to the earlier chapter, hydrate before we exercise, maintain hydration during exercise, and then understand how much hydration we need following the exercise to get back to a euhydrated state. So apparently, something that I think is quite weird, and I can't really say that I understand totally why there would be sex differences when you are hypohydrated. So with mild hypohydration, so I think the book, when it says mild, is talking 1 to 2%, right? So enough to affect you in the classroom, enough to possibly affect you in endurance training, right? So in women, the research sees decreased concentration and decreased mood, increased perception of exertion. So if you're using a Borg scale, they would say, oh, I'm working much harder, but if you're watching their heart rate, they're not working harder, right? So their perception of how hard they're working goes up, and they suffer more headaches. And then when they look at the men and they do the same kind of idea, they put them at 1 to 2% hypohydration, they see decreased vigilance, decreased memory, and increased tension and fatigue. So different responses between the sexes, and I can't say I understand why that would be, but quite interesting, I think. And that is it for heat. So we've done altitude, we've done heat. The third one is the cold, right? There's some really interesting information about training in the cold or competing in the cold. There's not very much adaptation. It's not like we see with altitude and heat, right? We don't acclimatize to the cold. That doesn't happen. So we just feel cold, right? And if you think about it, right, that's actually what we experience, right? It's not like over over the winter here when it's below freezing every day that we ever get used to it being below freezing. Okay? So there's very little adaptation in the cold information, but there's some quite interesting physiological effects of the cold that can impact performance. So, plus of course, there's always the risk of hypothermia, which leads to death. So all of these three extremes of environments can end up being hugely dangerous if you don't treat them with respect, right? So it's important to understand hypothermia so that, you know, what if you're out hiking and you twist your ankle, right? Or something like that, okay? So how much stuff do I have to carry with me, right? All that kind of information. So yeah, there's some really cool info on the cold. I'll let you guys do that. And then after Thanksgiving, we will look at training different populations. So they put women and children in there, so you've got to, it's a little bit frustrating that most of the information, most of the research up until fairly recently, remember that women couldn't run a marathon until 1972, so up until fairly recently, there's not been very much research on women exercising and physiological responses to exercise. So that chapter covers women, it covers the elderly. I usually pick the diabetic population, can't remember what else is in there, diabetes, I can't remember. But I don't normally cover the whole chapter because we don't have time right at the end of the semester to cover the whole chapter. So I picked some of the populations that I think you might come across in the kinds of jobs that you're going for. So, over Thanksgiving, I have not looked at your FIT programs yet. I do apologize for that. And I will get those sorted out over the break. And then we just have one more exam when we get back. In this class, I think. Oh, and the second physical activity log, of course. So, yeah. Questions? Miss Molly, you're the only one there to ask any questions.
Okay, no, not so many questions. This sounds pretty straightforward. I do need to talk to you about my physical portfolio thing.
Okay.
So before we turn the next one in, you commented on it to talk to you about it. So